We, we could acapulco it. All right. Let's see. Anybody remember the question from this morning? What was it? That was the theme, but what was the question? Are we ready? Are you ready? Well, tonight I have another question. Can God trust us to be faithful stewards? So, in the morning, are we ready? And in the evening, can God trust us? Open your Bibles, if you would, to Luke 16, 1 through 13. My Bible's right there, if you want, somewhere. Luke 16, and we're going to be mainly into Luke. And you might want to, there'll be no PowerPoints tonight. Everything's going to be, you'll read it out of the Bible or listen to me. But I can sum up Luke 16 pretty simply. All 13 verses can be summed up in 3 words. 3 words can sum up the entire Luke 16, 1 through 13. In simple terms, Jesus is saying, don't be stupid. That's what he's saying. I think you may agree with me at the end, or maybe not. But it tells us in there that the wealth of this world is temporary. It's going to fail us, but we need to use our wealth that we have here for eternal, unfailing purposes, to build relationships that will endure forever. And when we give our offerings, we're giving away part of the wealth of this world for eternal purposes. And in chapter 16, Jesus teaches about the wrong attitudes about wealth. There are many different thoughts about a wealthy Christian. And we're going to have wealthy Christians in heaven. But it's hard. Christ has told us it's hard because wealth can get in our way. He talks about our possessions, what we have, how we're going to deal with what he's given us to use. I found this to be kind of interesting. Jesus talked about money in 16 out of the 38 parables. There's 38 parables, 16 of them concern money. 1 out of 10 verses in the gospel deals with money. 1 out of 10. There's that 10% thing. Boy, that's a pesky little thing that keeps getting there. Then, the Bible has 500 verses on prayer. 500 verses. There's a little less than 500 verses on faith. I just preached for 3 weeks on faith, but yet there's really less than 500 verses. But there's over 2,000 verses on money and possessions. So there's 4 times as many verses on money and possession as there is on faith. It seems kind of out of kilter to what we preach, because preachers normally preach on faith, preach on prayer, preach on love. We don't like them to preach on that money thing, that possession thing. But preachers don't like preaching on it. Well, we're going to look at the foolish manager, the foolish steward in this parable. There's several things that we need to note. Number 1 is the accountability. The accountability. If you'll read verses 1 and 2, you're going to see that the steward is accountable. When the owner come back, he found that the steward had not been using the money properly, the possessions properly. There was some accountability that had to be reckoned with. It's interesting to note who this parable was given to. It wasn't given to the Gentiles. It wasn't given to the Pharisees. It wasn't given to the priest. Who was it given to, Janice? The disciples were the ones given this parable. Now, why should he give the disciples this message about the foolish steward? Well, what were the disciples? Stewards of what Jesus had given them. A couple of reasons that the manager was accountable. A couple of reasons that you and I are accountable. One, and the most important thing is, God is the owner. Talks about the owner coming back and the manager was held accountable. God is the owner. There's no way to get around it. You and I are the managers. I own nothing. I manage what I'm given. Alan and I were talking about what we're going to leave our children, and I told him I ain't leaving mine much. He said he ain't leaving his a lot either, so we're managing ours just right. Now, when we die, and we will die, we absolutely take nothing with us. Now, Jackie had some thoughts on that. You want to tell them your thoughts? You know, there's many jokes and stories about taking your wealth with you. You don't. You take nothing with you except what you did in this world. So that's the number one reason. Your very breath comes from God. Your ability to walk, work, to do anything comes from God. If God decided to take my breath, I wouldn't live to finish this sermon. I would be dead on the floor. Nothing anybody could do to change that. God is in charge of that. You aren't, I'm not. Every gift we have, every possession we have, God is the owner. Here's the hard part. We have a hard time reconciling ourselves to that. Sometimes we have a hard time remembering that God is the owner. We actually think we own it. Listen to our talk. Well, I own this. I own that. I have this. I have that. It's always possessive. We always do it with first person possessive. I've never heard anybody really tell me in a sincere conversation, well, God owns all this and I'm just managing it for him right now. Now, they may feel that way. They may believe that way. I believe that way. I don't think I've ever said that in a sentence in my entire life. Somebody asked me where we're at, and I said, well, we own some land out here. We have a house out there. What do you drive? Well, we have a such and such. We own a such and such. It's a hard thing, but we have to settle it. We have to settle it in our own self that God is the owner. The second, this is important, the second reason that we have accountability is that God as the owner has expectations of the manager. God has expectations of me. God has expectations of you. God owns it. God has expectations. This all comes out in that parable. When the master comes back, he wants to know what we've done with what he's given us. The first thing he wants, and the first one of our possessions that he wants, isn't our money, isn't our land, isn't our wealth. He wants us, ourselves. We have to surrender to God. That is the first thing we have to surrender. Once we surrender to God, it makes it awful easy, makes it easier to surrender the other stuff. But we have to surrender ourselves. This is the first and foremost thing. We're told in Romans 12:1. You don't have to look it up. I'll read it unless you want to. I'll read it to you. Romans 12:1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So this is what we're being told by Paul, that we're to offer ourselves up as an act of worship. We're to give ourselves totally to God. This morning we talked about worshiping, and we even got into worshiping in our sleep. It was an interesting discussion in Sunday school, and had a good time with it. But we're to give ourselves up to worship God. We don't like the word slave. That's really not in vogue anymore. There's a lot of negative connotations about the word slave. But in reality, I am the slave to Jesus Christ. He bought and paid for my freedom. That makes me his slave. And most of us kind of rankle at that word, but it's a good word in relationship to Jesus Christ. It's a horrible word in relationship to anything else, because people can be a slave to money, people can be a slave to other people can be a slave to work, people can be a slave to their desires, people can be a slave to many things, but being a slave to Christ is the only good way to be a slave. We have to give ourselves. After we give ourselves, next comes our possessions. He has an expectation of what I do with my possessions that he's given me. Jesus says in Luke 14:33, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. We have to give up everything. Now, there are some people they think that means we have to give it away to the poor. We have to take a poverty vow. There are priests, and I respect them for it. They'll take a vow of poverty, and they'll own nothing because they literally give it all up for the Lord. I think that's a great thing. I'm not sure that's what he's telling all of us we have to do, that we have to become priests living in a convent. What it says here is, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. I have to give up my wife, my family, my possessions, and make Christ first in my life. If I put any of them before, I cannot be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Paul writes in Ephesians 5:15 and 17, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. One translation, one of the English ones, says, make every minute count. Make every minute count. Most of us waste a minute or two a day. Anybody in here guilty of wasting a couple of minutes a day? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I could probably add on to that till we get to the point pushing 24 hours sometimes for some of us, but we waste time. I talked to my sister this afternoon. They're leaving Southern Illinois as soon as her break comes in her chemo treatment, and they're moving to Iowa so they can be closer to her one daughter and the grandchildren. She only got one daughter. They're moving there. For whatever the rest of her life is, she wants to be close. She wants to make every minute count with the grandchildren. I perfectly understand that. Now, I wish she'd have went 2 years ago or 5 years ago. But now when she's faced with what might be a limited amount of seconds, she wants to make every one of them count. That's really how we should be living for Christ. We should make every minute count. Because I don't know, and you do not know, when that last breath will come. I may be a lot closer to going over than she is. Am I making my minutes count? Am I making every second count? Or am I wasting them? Truthfully, I waste a lot of them. We're not focused because there's nothing to focus. The Bible tells us right here, be very careful then how you live. This is Paul. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. We should use every opportunity for God's kingdom. Witnessing for Christ, witnessing for the kingdom, trying to bring more people into the kingdom. That should be our main mission in life. Loving our neighbor after we love God first. Next thing that he wants. First it's us, then our possessions. He wants our gifts and our abilities. Jesus has an expectation of what we're going to do with what he's given us. Peter 4:10 says, each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administrating God's grace in its various forms. Now, more times than I can recall, I've had people look me square in the eye and say, I don't have any gifts. And I have to look back at them and say, then you think the Bible lied to you. Because everyone upon salvation gets a gift. Some multiple gifts, but you got at least one. Now, are you using that gift? Most people don't even know what their gift is. Took me 5 decades of my life to figure out what most of mine were and should be. And God gives us gifts. He also gives us abilities. You can have a gift and you can have an ability. The gift is different than the ability. An ability is something that you can hone, make better, practice, make more perfect. Music, you have a musical ability, you can teach yourself to play. It can be a gift that you have that, but it's also an ability. A gift is something that is just given to you. You're to use it for the Lord. He wants us to give those gifts and use them wisely. Our owner has this expectation that we'll build up the kingdom. Ourselves, our possessions, our gifts, our talents are to be used for Him, for His purpose. We're to preach the good news, the story of redemption, the story of Jesus Christ. We're to preach that we're only saved by our sins through the blood of Christ. Thessalonians 2:4. On the contrary, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please men, but God, who tests our hearts. So we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. He's not talking about just the disciples here, although this is given to the disciples. He's talking about every Christian. That's every one of our missions. We're entrusted with the gospel. Now, can everybody be a Billy Graham? No. Can everybody get up and speak to multitudes of people? No. Can everyone love their neighbor? Can everyone do kindnesses in the name of Christ? Can everyone reach out, hold a hand that's grieving? Can everyone care? That we can do. There's a little saying I run across. I like this. I sometimes feel like this. God put me on this earth to accomplish a certain number of things. Right now, I'm so far behind that I'll never die. I know it's kind of a cute thing. I laughed about it when I said, but I feel that way sometimes. When I look at all the things that need to be done with our church, through our church, by our church, through your preacher, by your preacher should do. When I look at all the things that we should be accomplishing for Christ, and then I don't have a clue how we're going to do it. I think I've got so much looking at me that I can't ever die because I'll never get it all done. And God wants us to be burdened with telling the gospel, with doing the kingdom work. He wants us to be burdened with it. He doesn't want us to be non-burdened. There's nowhere in the Bible it says that we should just kind of be lackadaisical and just, come see, come what. We're supposed to be working for the kingdom. We're not supposed to have fear. We're not supposed to have anxiety. But we're also supposed to be working for the kingdom. We've got to get it done. Now, the second thing in this story is the assessment. Now we're moving on to verse 3. The moment that the unwise manager realized that he is going to lose his job, he has a moment of truth. He does an assessment on where he's at. Every position I ever had in my career, there was always that moment. You would sit down with the CEO, you'd sit down with the boss, and they would say, Mr. Jernigan, I would like you to tell me where you would like to be and you see yourself in 5 years. My normal answer was employed. I'd like not to do something so stupid that I'd be unemployed in 5 years. Most of the time, I told them, I'd like to be sitting where you're at, asking somebody else that same question. And, that's the truth. We have to assess where we're at. And as the church, we have to assess, where are we at as St. John's? Where are we at as Christians? Are we content where we're at? Are we wanting to be just here 5 years from now and not get fired? Where are we at? Are we content? Or are we not content? I don't want to be content. I want to be burdened. I want to try to do more, do it better, and work harder for Christ. Excuse me. Here's what the manager said in verse 3. The manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master's taken away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. Well, you know what? I'm not really strong enough to dig, and I'm really not crazy about begging either. So this is an assessment. First, he realizes that he's in trouble. We have to do an assessment with our Christian life to see if we're in trouble. Are we okay where we're at? Are we using the resources? Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Or do we have a little bit of adjustment to do? The owners come home and this guy's not been doing a good job. We don't know. He could have been lazy, could have been irresponsible, he could have been dishonest. We really don't know what his problem was. But he hadn't got the job done. Sometimes we don't get the job done, and we have to assess why. The time when I've made changes in my life, or the most frequent time I've made big changes in my life, is usually when I'm at the bottom of something. I can't get no lower. All I can do is go up, so we have to make some changes. You know, the first rule of getting yourself out of that hole is to quit digging. Well, sometimes that's hard to do. You have to take and assess that I keep shoveling and I keep getting deeper, so we got to quit digging. Well, we do that assessment. We try to make some changes. Now, 4-7, verses 4-7 is the action. This is after the requirements are met, after God's laid out what we need to do, we make this assessment to ourselves. Then what action? You know, it's an action step. After every incident, use of force incident, we'd always have an after-action report. We'd have to sit down, we'd have to write in detail what led up to it, what happened, and what the end results were. There's an after-action report, so we get a big picture of what happened. Well, we have to do that here too. There's the action. And the owner comes back and he fires the manager, but he does something a little bit different than what you might think of. He gives him time to settle the accounts. The manager was shrewd. He sat down with the people who owed money to the master, and they began to wheel and deal. He was the original deal maker. He wheeled and he dealed. And the foolish manager may have overcharged the people. We don't know. May have let the interest go, made deals with them to bring the money back in, or some of the money back in, and was really trying to settle these accounts. What do we learn from that? We have to use every opportunity wisely. I am to use the opportunity that God gives me to settle the accounts wisely. Verse 8, we see the master praises his dishonest manager. Now that gives me a little pause. Here's a guy, he's been dishonest, he's fired, no longer trustworthy, but the master praises him. Remember, we're talking about a parable here. So let's make it me. I've been a dishonest servant. I have not used the resources wisely. God has chastised me, but now God praises me? It doesn't make sense, does it? We'll get there. Why would he praise a dishonest manager? He didn't praise him for the bad job. He commended him because he had acted shrewdly. He had seen where he was at and did something to change where he was at. It says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than they are people of the light. That's verse 8. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. If we haven't used the gifts, if we have not used the talents, if we have not used our abilities, if we have not used our possessions, if we have not used our wealth correctly, we make the assessment. God gives us time to rectify that, to use these things the way we should, so that we will be welcome in eternal dwellings. We have an opportunity to do what the shrewd manager did, and that's reconcile what he did wrong. He was commended for the fact that once he realized there was a problem, he took immediate action. Immediate action. It's very important. Some of us, and looking around this vast audience, this almost unnumberable amount of people. Okay, I'm stretching it just a little bit. But I'm looking out here, and this probably does not apply to anyone sitting in this room except maybe me. But you might be saying, I'm sure God's given me gifts that I don't use for the kingdom. I'm sure I'm not really using my time for the Lord. I'm positive I haven't settled the ownership problem. I'm struggling with, maybe I'm the foolish manager. Now, while this probably does not pertain to any of you, it's a question I have to ask myself daily. It's also a question that people that are watching this video may have to struggle with. So it's a good question to ask. Am I the foolish steward? The good news, there's good news. God gives us a chance, just like the owner gave that foolish steward a chance to settle the accounts, to get right. Found another quote. I like this quote. You may know it. I'd run across it for the first time. Nobody can go back and start a new beginning, but anyone can start today and make a new ending. I like that. We can't go back. I can't change yesterday. I can't go back. I can't take back the words that I say. I can't go back, take back the deeds. I can apologize. I can recompense people, but I can't go back and change it. But I can start today to make a new ending of where I'm at from today. I like that. And I think that's what this parable is going for. The Lord said the man should be commended because he used his opportunity wisely. We need to be in the business of investing in eternity. It's like today when we took up our special offering. I don't know how much we took up, but whatever we took up, $1 to $1 million, whatever we took up, it'll go to help people. That's investing in our eternal, our love for our neighbor. God doesn't need our money. God needs us to be willing to give our money. There's a big difference. When you put your money in the offering plate, some people think it goes to heaven, to the, heaven's bank. It doesn't go there. It's not in a golden vault. It's not there. God's not sitting on your dollars, not paying you 0.1% interest on it, not giving you any of that. When you give your money to the church, to God, it doesn't have to be just church. When you give it for God's use, you're investing in eternity. Missions is big. Miss Linda will agree with that. Missions is big. When we give to missions, we give that money so that people can hear about Jesus Christ that might not ever hear about Jesus Christ. That's part of our job. That's part of what we're commanded to do. Giving to missions is vital and important. That's really nice if you're called to be a missionary. I thank God that that wasn't one of my callings. But I know people that are. One of our nieces, one of Mark's daughters, just got back from a mission trip. I love seeing young kids go on these mission trips. It vitalizes them, but it also lets them see the importance of God's work. I think it makes a lifelong change in these people. I think that we need to look, if we ever have an opportunity to send a youth on a mission trip, that we do that. You may feel called to go on a mission trip. I think we should be behind it 100% if you feel like the Lord's calling you. Missions are important. We don't know what God's going to use the money for, but we know that the missionaries evangelize people, and that's a good use for it. God uses the money to change hearts. Instead of having a golden vault full of money, paper money, we have men and women that will be in heaven directly because of what you've said, done, or given. You may not know that until you get to heaven. You may not know that what you contributed led to the salvation of somebody that you've never met, but you will know. You can look at our tithes and gifts and our offerings as trying to pay the bills and keep the doors open. These are important things. We've got to pay for the electricity. We've got to pay for that nice air we got going. We got to pay the bills. But it's a lot more than that. We're keeping our doors open so that people can come in. I wish they were coming in by the multitude, but we're here. Our job is to go. Our job is to bring. We should be shepherding people into this church. I understand that it's hard with a small church. That's still our mission. That's what we should be doing. It's what your pastor should be doing. It's what we should be doing. That's the only way they're going to hear the message that can send them to heaven. Your giving allows me as the pastor not to be bivocational. I get a retirement, but if I was not here at the church, I would be working somewhere. And if trying to split the time up between working and doing this, I find I admire the ones that are capable of doing that. I've known pastors that had 5 churches and a job. God knew better than to give me 5 churches and a job. He understands my inability way more than I understand it. But yet that's part of what we give, and that's what we do. We accomplish our goal of building a strong, loving church right here in Blackshear, a place for the youth and families. That's what we're investing in. Am I, are you, are we using these opportunities that we have? I don't always. Trust must be earned. We can tell somebody, trust me. Anytime somebody says, trust me, I always have a real problem with that whole trusting them part, you know? If you got to tell me to trust you, there's something wrong. Well, trust can never be given or granted without being earned. Verses 10 and 12 tells us that. We need to earn the trust with the master. If we can't be faithful in a few things, why would he give us more things to do? If I'm misusing what I've been given, why would the master give me more? If I have the wrong attitude towards things and possessions, do you think God's going to give me more so I can have a wrong attitude about it? Those of you that have raised children, which is most of us, when your 16-year-old son or daughter tears up the car you give them, you run out and get them another one right away and say, it's okay. No. They do what for a while? Walk. Well, guess what? When you tear up that car that God gave you, guess what you're going to do? How much can God trust you with? Well, trust can be measured. How do you measure trust? Well, Jesus tells us. He says that he measures trust by a very simple method. If you're trustworthy in a few things, I will give you more. So if God's not giving you more, that would be not necessarily money, possessions, homes, but more opportunities to serve, more people to witness to, more times to use your gift, more talent. If God's not giving you more, then you probably need to look at what you're doing with what you currently got already. If you're not using it, he's not going to give you more. He measures by what you're doing with it right now. Story I found about a preacher. He was trying to teach this principle to the church. It was a farming community, so he went to one of the farmers and said, Joe, if you had 1,000 cows and God asked you for 50, would you give it to him? Oh, Joe said, yes, I would, preacher. I'd be proud to give God 50 of my cows. I said, that's good, Joe. Well, Joe, tell me, if you had 100 horses and God asked you for 50, would you give it to him? Preacher, just like the cows, I'd be proud to give God 50 of my horses. Pastor said, well, Joe, if you had 2 hogs and God asked you for 1, would you give it to him? The farmer said, Joe said, now that's not right. You know I got 2 hogs. We're okay with giving till it comes down and somebody wants one of our hogs. We just don't want to give it up. And there's one more thing that we can learn. We're to be totally devoted to God. Verse 13. No servant can serve 2 masters. Either will hate one and love the other, or will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So my question is, can God trust you? Do you love God more than money? Do you let money get before you and God? How about our possessions? And it could be family. It could be many things. It could be work. It could be anything. You put a name on it, and if you put it in front of God, you're not serving God. And Jesus said, if you do not give all of it up, you cannot be his disciple. So we have to be real careful in what we do with what we've been blessed with. Those that have been blessed with more have a bigger burden. That's why it's hard, I think, for the wealthy. I think it's hard for the wealthy because they get so caught up in the wealth, the accumulation of wealth, the acquiring of wealth, the maintaining of wealth, the worrying about people taking their wealth away. I had an aunt, God love her, that was raised dirt poor. She lived in a shack that most of you probably couldn't imagine. I ended up owning that shack before I burned it down, but it was an accident. But they were raised dirt poor. She ended up having some money. She married an engineer, and they got to where they were comfortable and stuff. She wouldn't even come back to the state of Tennessee because she didn't want to be reminded of poverty. This woman lived to be not poor. I want to live to be not lost. I want to live to serve God. We cannot let anything, our past, our present, or our future, get between us and God and what we're supposed to do. We need to be faithful, and we need to use all the blessings that we've been given. We don't want to hold back on anything. We don't want to tell God, God, I'll give you 10%, but not a bit more. We need to give God what God lays upon our heart to give when He calls upon to give it. And it's not always about money or possessions. It's about our time, our witness. It's about being in a checkout line and letting someone go ahead of you that has very few things. It's about kindness at a red light, which I need to practice severely. But it's exactly what we're talking about. Even though that person there may not know that I'm a Christian or not a Christian, God knows. God sees what I do and what I don't do. And He sees all of us. Are we serving Him? Are we surrendered to Him? And my basic question is, can God trust you? I work every day to try to get where God can trust me. And I pray that you work every day so that God can trust you. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that this parable of the foolish steward be used to awaken our knowledge, our hearts, that we serve you, Father. We serve you. You don't serve us, we serve you. You've given us gifts, abilities, talents. And Father, I pray that we use each of these for your glory, for your kingdom. I pray that the job that you have for each one of us, the path that you have laid out, that we follow, that we obey, the ones that we are supposed to speak to and bring into salvation of knowledge of your Son, Jesus Christ, I pray that we do that. I pray we never tire of doing that. I pray, Father, that you give us the strength and encouragement, and I pray that we encourage one another, that we fellowship together, that we, when we're down, when we're weak, that we can rely on each other for strength and courage, Father. I pray this. In Jesus' name is holy and mighty name. The congregation said.